A speeding car, sirens blaring, the desperate wail of a police radio cutting through the night, and then the crash. Metal screamed against metal, glass shattered, and the world went silent, except for him, the driver. Broken and battered, he clung to life. They pulled him from the mangled wreckage, his eyes vacant, his body unresponsive. He wasn't dead, not yet, but he wasn't truly alive either. His crime? Murder? A brutal act that had shocked the city, leaving a trail of blood and unanswered questions. Now he lay shackled to the hospital bed, an armed guard, a silent sentinel at his door. The silence was unnerving. He was a monster, they said, a killer. But even monsters deserved their day in court. Yet he remained frustratingly, terrifyingly silent. Days turned into weeks. The machines hummed, the nurses whispered. The guard never left his post. The silence, it seemed, was about to be broken. His name was Theo Faber, a man of shadows and secrets. He had once been a celebrated artist, his canvases alive with colour and passion. Now they lay forgotten in the dusty corners of his mind. He was a renowned psychotherapist, his reputation built on unravelling the darkest corners of the human psyche. Theo had dedicated his life to understanding the motivations of men like the silent patient. What drove them to such acts of unspeakable violence? What demons lurked in the shadows of their souls? But the silent patient was different. The crime had sent shockwaves through the city. Alicia Berenson, a famous painter known for her haunting portraits, had been accused of murdering her husband, Gabriel. He was found dead in their luxurious home, a single gunshot wound to the head. Alicia, covered in blood, stood over his lifeless body, a gun in her hand. The evidence was damning. The gun was registered in her name, the fingerprints on the weapon matched hers, yet from the moment of her arrest, Alicia refused to speak. She sat in her cell, her eyes vacant, her face a mask of indifference. Theo delved into Alicia's past, piecing together the fragments of a life shattered by tragedy and loss. Her childhood had been marred by the sudden death of her mother, a loss that left her emotionally scarred. She found solace in art, pouring her pain and loneliness onto the canvas. Her talent was undeniable, her paintings a raw and visceral expression of her inner turmoil. Gabriel, a successful art dealer, had been captivated by her work and her beauty. He swept her off her feet, promising her love, stability, and a life free from worry. But behind the facade of their perfect life, darkness lurked. Gabriel, it seemed, was not the loving husband he pretended to be. The love that had once bound them together was slowly being eroded by suspicion and fear. The Grove, a name whispered with a mix of pity and dread. It was the hospital ward where hope went to die, not for the physically ill, but for the mentally shattered, those whose minds had become battlefields, their sanity hanging by the thinnest of threads, where the ghosts of trauma roamed free and the living envied the peace of the dead. Theo had walked these halls before, his footsteps echoing in the sterile silence. Each room held a story, a life fractured and fragmented. But the silent patient, the comatose killer, he was different. He wasn't lost in the labyrinth of his own mind, not in the traditional sense. He was trapped behind a wall of his own making, his silence a fortress, or perhaps a prison. Officer Davis, a man of routine and discipline, his world defined by order and control. He had spent years patrolling the streets, facing danger head-on, his resolve never wavering, but guarding the silent patient. It was a different kind of duty, one that gnawed at his nerves, tested the limits of his composure. The silence was the worst part. The constant, oppressive silence. He could handle the beeping of the machines, the hushed whispers of the nurses, even the occasional moan from a neighbouring room. But the silent patient, he was an unsettling presence, a living corpse that seemed to watch him with invisible eyes.
What if the silent patient wasn't as helpless as he seemed?
Section 3. The Room. Theo paused at the threshold, his hand hovering over the door handle. The air inside the room felt different, charged with an unseen energy. It was dimly lit, the only source of light a single window overlooking the city below. The patient lay motionless on the bed, his body dwarfed by the white sheets, his face obscured by a network of tubes and wires. He was a pale imitation of a man, his skin waxy, his chest rising and falling with the rhythmic whoosh of the ventilator. A prisoner in his own body, trapped in a cage of flesh and bone.
Theo's gaze fell on the restraints, securing the patient's wrist to the bed rails. He had seen the reports, the whispers among the staff. The silent patient was prone to violent outbursts, his rage erupting in sudden, uncontrollable spasms.
Days bled into nights. The relentless rhythm of the hospital, a symphony of beeps and hushed whispers, became Theo's constant companion. He spent hours by the silent patient's bedside, observing, analyzing, searching for a crack in the wall of silence that entombed the man's mind. He spoke to him, his voice a low murmur in the sterile air, sharing stories, thoughts, even snippets of his own troubled past, hoping to elicit a response. But the silent patient remained unmoved, his face an impassive mask. One evening, as Theo prepared to leave, he noticed something strange. A sheet of paper lay on the bedside table, partially concealed beneath a pile of medical charts. It was a drawing, a simple sketch in charcoal, the lines raw, almost frantic. The drawing depicted a man, his features twisted in a silent scream, his eyes wide with terror. The drawing sent a chill down Theo's spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen those eyes before. He showed the drawing to the nurses, to Officer Davis. But they dismissed it as the random scribbles of a disturbed mind. They had seen it all, they said, their voices weary. But Theo couldn't let it go. He spent hours poring over the patient's file, searching for a clue, a connection, anything that could explain the drawing. Then he found it. A name, buried deep within the police report mentioned in passing. Theo returned to the hospital that night, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Fear warred with curiosity, anger with a desperate need for answers. As he entered the silent patient's room, he felt a shift in the air, a palpable tension that sent a shiver down his spine. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the rhythmic hiss and sigh of the ventilator.
Silent.
He pulled up a chair, his gaze drawn to the unmoving figure on the bed. The patient's eyes were still closed, his breathing shallow but steady. He took a deep breath, his voice a hushed whisper in the stillness.
Silent.
A jolt, like an electric current, shot through Theo. He recoiled instinctively, his heart pounding against his ribs. The silent patient's eyes, once vacant and lifeless, were now open, fixated on him with an intensity that bordered on predatory. They were not the eyes of a man waking from a dream, but of one emerging from a nightmare.
Silent.
The air in the room seemed to crackle with a strange energy, a palpable shift that sent a shiver down Theo's spine. He had expected fear, confusion, perhaps even a flicker of recognition, but there was none of that in the silent patient's eyes, only a cold, calculating awareness that chilled him to the bone. Theo's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the silent patient's eyes, as if mesmerized by some unseen force. He wanted to call for help, to run from the room, to pretend he hadn't witnessed this impossible awakening. But something held him rooted to the spot, a morbid fascination that warred with his instincts for self-preservation.
Silent.
Then the silent patient's hand moved. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through Theo. His fingers, still bound by the restraints, twitched, reaching for something on the bedside table. Theo followed the silent patient's gaze and saw a notepad and pen lying beside the empty water glass. Theo hesitated, torn between his professional curiosity and the primal fear clawing at his mind. He knew he should refuse, should alert Officer Davis outside the door. But the silent patient's desperate gaze compelled him to act. He reached for the notepad and pen, his movements stiff and mechanical. He placed them within the patient's reach, their fingers brushed. The touch sent a jolt of cold energy through him. As the patient's fingers closed around the pen, Theo felt a chill. He watched, his breath shallow, as the patient began to write. Each stroke of the pen was slow, deliberate. Theo leaned closer, straining to decipher the words, and then he saw it. A single word scrawled shakily.
Run.
A rush of adrenaline flooded Theo's veins. The single word, stark and urgent, shattered his illusion of safety. He should have run then, alerted the authorities. But a strange paralysis gripped him. The patient's eyes bored into Theo's soul. And then it began. A low growl echoed through the room. The machines flickered, their beeps morphing into chaos. Theo stumbled back, reaching for the door. As quickly as it began, the chaos ceased. The machines fell silent, their screens flickering and dying. Theo stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat, and then he saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, silhouetted against the city lights. It stood beside the bed, its form shifting. The patient's bed was empty. Terror surged through Theo. He stumbled back, searching for the door handle.
Don't you recognize me, Theo?
The words hung in the air. Theo's blood ran cold. He knew that voice, had heard it in his nightmares. He whirled around, his mind reeling from the truth. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the faint light of the hallway, was the silent patient. But his eyes, once vacant and lost, now blazed with a terrifying intensity, reflecting a darkness that chilled Theo to the bone. The restraints that had bound him to the bed lay discarded on the floor, as if they were mere threads to his newfound strength.
I told you to run, the silent patient whispered, his voice a raspy growl that sent shivers down Theo's spine. But you never were very good at taking advice, were you?
Theo could only stare, his mind struggling to process the impossible scene before him. The silent patient, the comatose killer, was gone. In his place stood... The figure in the doorway took a step forward, his shadow stretching out like a monstrous hand reaching for Theo's throat.
Now it's your turn to be silent.
A scream died in Theo's throat as darkness engulfed him. The silence, it seemed, had found its new voice.